Vanessa Thompson was the kind of woman who could light up a room just by walking in. She had a warm smile, a big heart, and a laugh that made everyone around her feel at home. She was proud of who she was, a strong, confident black woman who didn't care what the world thought of her size. She dressed in bright colors, spoke her mind, and never let anyone dull her shine. She lived in a quiet town with her husband, David Thompson, a man who, at first glance, seemed as ordinary as they came. David was tall, strong, and had a calm presence that made people respect him without knowing why. He wasn't one to talk too much, and he didn't like attention. He worked in private security, spending his days protecting people and his nights enjoying peaceful moments with his wife. To Vanessa, David was the perfect husband. He was patient, loving, and always made her feel safe. She never had to worry about a thing when he was around. He never raised his voice, never got into fights, and always handled problems with quiet confidence. She had no idea that her husband was once one of the most feared Marines in the world. David never talked about his past. He didn't need to. His days in the military were behind him, and he wanted nothing more than to live a simple life. But if anyone who had served with him saw him now, they would be shocked. Because David Thompson was not just any soldier, he was a legend. His name carried weight in the military, and even some of the toughest men had once looked up to him with a mix of respect and fear. But Vanessa knew none of this. To her, David was the man who held her hand when they walked down the street, who made her coffee in the morning, and who rubbed her feet after a long day. She didn't care about his past. She only cared about the man he was with her. One Saturday morning, Vanessa woke up feeling good. The sun was shining, and she had plans to go to the store to pick up some groceries. She hummed a tune as she got dressed, slipping into a bright floral dress that made her feel cheerful. David sat at the kitchen table, drinking his coffee and reading the news on his phone. "I'll be back in a bit," Vanessa said, grabbing her purse. David looked up at her, his sharp eyes scanning her face. He had always been protective, but he trusted Vanessa to handle herself. "Be careful," he said simply. Vanessa chuckled. "It's just a grocery run, babe. What's the worst that could happen?" David smiled, but deep inside, something told him to stay alert. He had learned long ago that trouble could come when you least expected it, but he didn't want to worry her, so he let her go with a kiss on the cheek. Vanessa walked out the door, unaware that this would be a day she would never forget. Vanessa drove through town with the windows down, enjoying the fresh air. It was a beautiful day, and she loved feeling the warm sun on her skin. She turned up the radio, singing along to one of her favorite songs as she made her way to the grocery store. When she pulled into the parking lot, she found a spot near the entrance and parked her car. It was a little busy, with people going in and out of the store, pushing carts full of groceries. Vanessa grabbed her shopping list from her purse and stepped out of the car, already thinking about what she needed to buy. As she walked toward the store, she noticed a group of men standing outside a bar across the street. They were dressed in leather jackets, their motorcycles lined up beside them. Vanessa didn't pay them much attention at first. She had seen bikers around town before. Most of them minded their own business, and she had no reason to be concerned. But as she reached the store entrance, she heard loud laughter coming from their direction. Something about the way they laughed made her stop for a second. She wasn't sure if it was just in her head, but it felt like they were looking at her. Shrugging it off, she pushed her cart into the store and focused on her shopping. She walked through the aisles, picking up everything on her list: fresh vegetables, a carton of milk, and some of David's favorite snacks. She smiled, thinking about how happy he would be when he saw the extra treats she got for him. Grocery shopping wasn't the most exciting thing in the world, but Vanessa always found a way to enjoy it. After about 20 minutes, she was done. She paid for her groceries and pushed her cart back to her car. As she loaded the bags into her trunk, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She glanced up and saw a few of the bikers from across the street walking in her direction. A strange feeling settled in her stomach, but she told herself to stay calm. Maybe they were just passing by. Maybe they weren't even looking at her, but then she heard one of them chuckle. Well, look at this," one of them said. Vanessa pretended not to hear him and kept loading her groceries. She wasn't about to entertain nonsense today. "Hey, lady, we're talking to you," another one said. She finally looked up and met their eyes. The men were standing just a few feet away now, smirking. There was something in the way they stared at her that made her uncomfortable. She took a deep breath, keeping her face steady. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The man in front shrugged. "Just saying hello. You new around here?" Vanessa frowned. She had lived in this town for years. "No." The man chuckled again. "Didn't think so. Just don't see your kind around here too often." Vanessa's grip tightened on the grocery bag she was holding. She knew exactly what he meant, but she refused to let them intimidate her. "I'm just here to do my shopping," she said simply, turning back to her car. But as she reached for the trunk, one of them stepped closer, blocking her way. Her heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. She had no idea that at that very moment, her husband was about to find out everything. Vanessa took a deep breath, keeping her posture strong. She had faced difficult people before, and she wasn't about to let a few strangers ruin her day. She calmly placed the last grocery bag into the trunk and reached for the car door, but the man standing in front of her didn't move. He was tall with a rough-looking beard and a leather jacket that had a faded logo on the back. His friends stood behind him, watching with amused expressions. She looked him in the eyes, refusing to show fear. "Excuse me, I need to get to my car," she said firmly. The man smirked, tilting his head slightly. "In a hurry?" he asked, his tone light, but with an edge to it. Vanessa's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. "I have things to do," she said simply. One of the other men laughed. "Oh, I bet you do. Maybe you should stick around, have a little chat with us first." She sighed, now feeling more annoyed than anything. She had been minding her own business, and these men had decided to bother her for no reason. She had no interest in arguing with them, but she also wasn't about to stand there and let them waste her time. "I don't have time for this," she said, her voice still calm. She reached for her car door again, but the bearded man suddenly stepped even closer, his large frame blocking her completely. Vanessa's heart started pounding harder. This was different now. They weren't just talking anymore. They were trying to intimidate her. She glanced around the parking lot, hoping someone else had noticed, but most people were either too far away or too busy to pay attention. The bearded man leaned in slightly. "You act real tough," he said, his voice lower now. "But we both know you're not." Vanessa clenched her jaw. She didn't know what they wanted from her, but she wasn't about to let them bully her. "Move," she said, her tone sharp. The man chuckled again, but this time there was something different in his expression. He wasn't just teasing anymore. He was testing her, seeing how far he could push. "Or what?" he asked. She could feel her pulse racing, but before she could respond, something unexpected happened. Her phone, which was still in her hand, suddenly rang. She looked down and saw David's name flashing on the screen. Relief flooded through her. She quickly answered. "Hey, babe." David's voice came through, steady and calm as always. "Everything okay?" Vanessa hesitated for a second. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but something in her husband's voice told her he already knew something was wrong. "Yeah," she started to say, but before she could finish, one of the men suddenly reached out and snatched the phone from her hand. "Well, that's just rude," the man said, looking at the screen before grinning at her. "Who's David?" Vanessa's stomach dropped. They had just made a big mistake. Because on the other end of that call, David Thompson had heard everything, and he was already on his way. David sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee when his phone rang. Seeing Vanessa's name on the screen, he smiled and answered. "Hey, babe," he said, but instead of hearing her usual cheerful voice, there was a pause. Then she spoke, but something in her tone felt off. "Hey, babe." David's instincts kicked in immediately. He had spent years in the military, trained to detect even the smallest changes in tone, breath, or background noise. And right now, something wasn't right. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm but focused. There was another pause. Then she said, "Yeah." But before she could finish, the call was interrupted. David heard a man's voice, one that didn't belong to Vanessa. "Well, that's just rude. Who's David?" David's entire body went cold. His fingers tightened around the phone, his heartbeat steady, but his mind already calculating. Someone had taken Vanessa's phone. Someone was standing too close to her. Someone was trying to mess with his wife. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys, his movements quick but controlled. Within seconds, he was out the door, sliding into his SUV. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he started the engine. Back in the parking lot, Vanessa's heart pounded as she stared at the man holding her phone. The way he smirked made her stomach turn. He had no idea what he had just done. "Give me my phone back," she said firmly. The man chuckled, looking at the screen as if deciding whether to hang up or keep talking. "David, your boyfriend." Vanessa clenched her jaw. "My husband." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he still seemed amused. "Well, let's see what hubby has to say," he said, lifting the phone to his ear. "Hey, David, you there?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice so calm and steady it sent a chill down Vanessa's spine came through. "Put my wife back on the phone." The man blinked, looking at the screen again. Something about the way David had spoken, so quiet, so controlled, made the smirk on his face falter for just a second. "She's a little busy right now," the man said, trying to sound tough. "Maybe she'll call you back." David's voice didn't change. It didn't rise. It didn't sound angry, but the weight of it was undeniable. "I'm 5 minutes away." The man let out a small laugh, but Vanessa noticed the shift in his expression. He was trying to brush it off, but something in David's voice had rattled him. David continued, "You have exactly 3 minutes to step away from my wife. If you don't, I promise you'll regret it." The man narrowed his eyes. "Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do about it?" David's next words made Vanessa's breath hitch. "You're about to find out." The call ended. The man looked at the phone, then at Vanessa, his smirk returning. "Guess we'll see if your husband's as tough as he sounds." Vanessa didn't say anything, because she knew one thing for sure. David wasn't tough. He was something far beyond that. And in just a few minutes, these men were going to learn exactly who they had just messed with. The parking lot suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. Vanessa's heart pounded, but not from fear. She knew her husband, and she knew these men had no idea what was coming. The man holding her phone still had a smug look on his face, but his fingers were gripping the device just a little tighter now. His friends were watching closely, some amused, some unsure. They had started this as a joke, but something about David's voice had changed the mood. Vanessa crossed her arms. "You really shouldn't have done that." The man chuckled, trying to act relaxed. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Vanessa didn't answer. She just waited. Less than 2 minutes later, the deep growl of an engine filled the air. It wasn't loud like the motorcycles parked across the street. It was smooth, controlled, powerful. The sound of a vehicle that didn't need to make noise to be noticed. A sleek black SUV pulled into the parking lot, moving with precision, as if the driver already knew exactly where he was going. The moment it stopped, the driver's door swung open. David Thompson stepped out. The air shifted. He didn't slam the door. He didn't rush. He simply stood there, eyes locked on Vanessa. And then, slowly, he turned his gaze to the men standing around her. The way he looked at them wasn't angry. It wasn't even threatening. It was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that sent shivers down a man's spine. Vanessa saw it immediately, the small flicker in the bearded man's expression. A hesitation. A second of doubt. He had been expecting some panicked husband, maybe a man who would yell or plead. But David wasn't panicked. He wasn't yelling. He was just watching. And somehow, that was worse. David took a step forward. Not too fast, not too slow. His movements were precise, measured. Everything about him spoke of control. "Vanessa," he said, his voice even. "Are you okay?" She nodded. "I'm fine." His eyes flicked to the man holding her phone. "Give it back." For a moment, the man didn't move. Then, realizing that every second he delayed made things worse for him, he tossed the phone back to Vanessa. She caught it without breaking eye contact with her husband. David took another step forward. The bikers weren't laughing now. "I'm going to ask this once," David said, his voice still calm. "Did any of you put your hands on my wife?" The bearded man scoffed. "Relax, man. We were just talking." David didn't blink. "That's not what I asked." Silence. None of them dared to answer. Then David took another step closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "You have exactly 10 seconds, he said quietly, "to apologize to my wife. Then you're going to walk away. And if I ever see you near her again, you won't like what happens next." The bikers exchanged glances. The bearded man swallowed, his jaw tightening. He wanted to argue, to push back, but something in David's eyes stopped him. Slowly, he exhaled. Then, in a stiff voice, he muttered, "Sorry." David tilted his head slightly. Louder. The man's fists clenched, but he wasn't stupid. "I said I'm sorry," he repeated, this time more clearly. David gave a single nod. "Good, now leave." The bikers hesitated, but then, one by one, they turned and walked away. Vanessa exhaled, shaking her head as David finally turned back to her. "Took you long enough," she teased. David smirked. "Had to make an entrance." And just like that, the moment was over. But Vanessa knew one thing for certain. No one messed with David Thompson's wife. The bikers walked away, but the tension in the air still lingered. Vanessa watched them cross the street, muttering to each other. A couple of them threw glances back, but none of them dared to say anything. The bearded man, the one who had taken her phone, kept his head down as he climbed onto his motorcycle. David didn't move until they were completely gone. Only then did he turn his full attention to Vanessa. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Vanessa nodded, but she let out a deep breath. "Yeah, just annoyed." David reached out, gently tucking the strand of hair behind her ear. It was such a small gesture, but it instantly made her feel safe. "I shouldn't have let you come alone," he said. She rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, David. It's the grocery store, not a war zone." David didn't smile. His jaw was still tight, his eyes scanning the area, as if making sure there were no more threats. That was just the kind of man he was, always alert, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Vanessa placed a hand on his chest. "Hey, I'm fine. You got here fast." His eyes met hers. "Of course I did." For a moment, they just stood there. Then, David sighed, finally letting go of some of the tension in his shoulders. "Let's get your groceries home." Together, they finished loading the bags into the SUV. Vanessa climbed into the passenger seat, while David got behind the wheel. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Vanessa glanced at him. His grip on the steering wheel was still firm, his muscles tense. "You're still mad," she observed. David didn't deny it. They were lucky. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Lucky?" David glanced at her before turning his eyes back to the road. "They have no idea who they were messing with. If they had touched you." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Vanessa shook her head with a small smile. "You're scary when you're in protector mode, you know that." David smirked. "I know." They drove in silence for a few moments before Vanessa spoke again. "I can take care of myself, you know." David chuckled. "I don't doubt that, but you shouldn't have to." She reached over and squeezed his hand. I love you, you know that. David's smirk softened into a genuine smile. I love you too. They pulled into their driveway, and David immediately got out to unload the groceries. As they carried the bags inside, Vanessa couldn't help but think about what had just happened. Those men had tried to intimidate her, thinking she was alone. They had no idea that she was married to the most feared Marine to ever walk into a battlefield. And now, they would never forget it. Later that evening, Vanessa sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, but her mind kept replaying the events from earlier. She wasn't scared anymore, just thinking about how quickly things had changed the moment David arrived. She glanced at him, sitting across the room at the dining table, quietly cleaning his favorite knife. His movements were slow, precise, almost relaxing. But she knew better. This wasn't just a habit. It was muscle memory, something drilled into him over years of training. David had been in dangerous situations before. He had faced men far worse than those bikers. That was why he hadn't needed to raise his voice or throw a punch. His presence alone had been enough. Vanessa smiled to herself. What? David asked without looking up. She shook her head. Nothing. Just thinking. He finally looked at her, setting the knife down. About today. She nodded. Yeah. They really had no idea what they were walking into, did they? David exhaled, leaning back in his chair. No. And that's a good thing. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Good thing. He nodded. If they had pushed it any further, I wouldn't have been able to hold back. His tone was serious, his eyes dark. And that wouldn't have ended well. For them. She believed him. She had seen glimpses of this side of David before. The side that made even the toughest men think twice. But he wasn't just strong. He was controlled. That was the difference. You handled it perfectly, she said, standing up and walking over to him. No one got hurt, but they'll never forget what happened today. David smirked. They better not. She laughed, wrapping her arms around his shoulders from behind. My hero. He chuckled, resting his hands over hers. Always. Just then, David's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, and his expression changed slightly as he read the screen. Vanessa frowned. Who is it? He hesitated for a second before answering. An old friend from the Marines. He works in law enforcement now. Vanessa tilted her head. And? David put his phone down and looked at her. They'd had complaints about that group before. The bikers. Turns out, they've caused trouble in other places too. Vanessa's stomach tightened. So today wasn't the first time they tried to intimidate someone. David shook his head. No, but it might be the last. A slow smile spread across Vanessa's face. Because of you. David didn't answer right away. He simply picked up his knife again, turning it over in his hands. Then finally, he said, let's just say, they won't forget today anytime soon. Vanessa leaned against him, feeling completely safe. She already knew one thing for sure. Those men had learned a lesson. And if they were smart, they'd never try something like that again. The next morning, Vanessa woke up feeling refreshed. The events of the previous day had left her shaken at first, but after David's calm and commanding way of handling the situation, she felt nothing but safe. She stretched and looked over at her husband. He was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, lacing up his boots. His movements were precise, efficient, just like always. Morning, Marine, she teased. David smirked but didn't stop tying his boots. Morning, beautiful. Vanessa sat up, watching him. You going somewhere? He nodded. Yeah. I need to check in with a friend. She raised an eyebrow. This about those bikers? David looked at her for a long moment before answering. Maybe. Vanessa sighed. David, you don't have to do anything. You already scared them off. David chuckled. I didn't do anything. He stood up, rolling his shoulders. but I want to make sure they don't do this to someone else. Not everyone has someone to protect them." Vanessa watched him for a moment, then got out of bed and walked over to him. She placed her hands on his chest. "You're always protecting people, aren't you?" David smirked. "It's what I do." She sighed but smiled. "Just be careful." He kissed her forehead. "Always." A couple of hours later, Vanessa was in the kitchen making breakfast when her phone buzzed. She picked it up and saw a message from David. "Handled." That was all it said. Vanessa chuckled. She could only imagine what that meant. Later that evening, David returned home, looking as calm as ever. Vanessa crossed her arms, leaning against the counter as he walked in. "So, are you gonna tell me what happened?" David smirked and kissed her cheek. "Let's just say, they got the message." She tilted her head. "The scary Marine message." He chuckled. "Something like that." Vanessa shook her head, but she couldn't help but smile. She knew David didn't go looking for trouble, but when it came to protecting the people he cared about, or even innocent strangers, he wouldn't hesitate. "You're something else, you know that," she said. David pulled her into his arms. "Yeah, and you love it." She laughed. "I do." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Vanessa felt nothing but gratitude. She had married a man who would do anything to protect her. A man who carried his strength with quiet confidence. A man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. And after what had happened, she knew those bikers wouldn't be bothering anyone else ever again. They had learned a lesson the hard way. Never mess with David Thompson's wife.